Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. This is part 2, talking about the cultural dimension of individualism versus collectivism. In the first part, we looked at what it means to be an individualistic or collectivist society and what are the consequences of such ideologies. In this episode, we're going to give 2 main national examples and a couple more national examples just to back these things up. The 2 main countries we're going to focus on are the USA and China. And the reason I've picked these 2 countries is because, quite surprisingly, over the last couple of decades, their scores in this dimension have changed quite drastically. On the one hand, the USA, a couple of decades ago, were probably the most individualistic country in the world. And in the original survey, in the original research, it scored 91 in individualism, which was the highest in the world. But recently, there was another survey, a new survey, an updated survey, and they scored just 60. So instead of being a highly individualistic society, nowadays, apparently, they're a slightly individualistic society. So we're going to talk about why that could be. Conversely, China, once a very collectivist society, scoring only 20 on this dimension, recently scored 43. So going from a very collectivist society to, again, only slightly collectivist. All right. So many countries have changed in this dimension over the years, but I think the US and China have changed probably the most drastically. So first of all, why is the US traditionally, or when we think of the US, why do we think of them as an individualistic society? Well, first of all, and from the inception of the US, it's quite clear. Because in the Declaration of Independence, the founding principles of the US were based on individual freedom, right? Like we said in the first episode, the big difference between individualism and collectivism is the difference personal freedom and social harmony. And in the Declaration of Independence, it specifically talks about individual rights, individual freedoms, right? So clearly we can see that it's individualistic, right? Another point which we touched on in part 1 is about economy. The US has been a capitalist and free market economy for a long time. And this exemplifies individualism because the point is that everybody is able to, let's say, make a business or do a job which they want to do, and they don't have any duty to do something for other people, right? You need to work, you need to pay taxes, but you don't need to work in this field, you don't need to work for this company. You're free to educate yourself and, apply for different jobs and do what you would like. And this is exemplified in the Declaration of Independence because it mentions the pursuit of happiness, right? And the pursuit of a happiness is unequivocally an individualistic pursuit. Although you could argue that happiness could come from being a part of a community, right, and doing things for the community. In the US example, the pursuit of happiness or the American dream focuses on the individual, doing something which will make you happy and will make you successful as an individual. Whether you decide to use your wealth to help your community or spend time with your family and so on is not mentioned here, right? You can do that or not, but the American dream is focused on individual pursuit of happiness. So what are some reasons for the relative decline of individualism in the US? Firstly, increasing social inequality. There's been a lot of research in the last couple of decades showing that since the golden age in the US, since the 50s and 60s, inequality has only increased. And while the rich have gotten richer, the poor have probably gotten poorer. This is not to say that, people earn less nominally than they did in 1960, but rather the average salary in the US now compared to the average house price, for example, is extremely different compared to how it was. For example, in the 60s, the average house price was probably a few years of the average salary, right? So if you had a regular job and you saved, let's say, 20% of your salary for 10 years, you could probably buy a house. Whereas nowadays, with the extortionate prices sometimes of houses in the US and also in Europe, it's near impossible to afford a house in 10 years. It might take you 30 years if ever. Another reason is the diverse population in the US. Of course, everybody knows that the US has always been a diverse population, more or less, right? Even though we can say that like white Americans are the majority ethnicity or people in America, they're not indigenous, right? They came from Europe and around the world and they settled in America. But in the last few decades, many nationalities have emigrated to the US in search of a better life, and they've brought their own culture with them. So the difference is, let's say, an Irish person or Italian person that went to the US 100 years ago, the descendants of them people are truly American, right? They were born in America, they speak just English and so on. Whereas, for example, many Latinos in the US speak Spanish, and many of them don't speak English or speak English not so well. So instead of adopting the American dream, fully, they still, have a strong family culture, family values. It's common that, for example, when Latinos emigrate to the US, they often try to bring their parents or bring their mother or something. So within their house, even though they're in the US, it's still more of a collectivist society, a collectivist family. So this can affect the whole country, right? Because still you have like the European descendants who are in America, who are still probably like the old Americans, individualistic and so on. But then you have many new people who, although moved to the US maybe 5, 10, maybe even 50 years ago, still they have their family around them, which come from more of a collectivist society, and they have not broken free, or they have not decided to abandon their native values, but rather to kind of mix it up, have a hybrid culture. Maybe some of their personal culture is more like the US and some is more like their home country, right? Whereas an American now who was born in the US, but their great-grandparents came to America 100 years ago, they've probably lost most of that culture, like the Italian culture or Irish culture, and they have more of a typical American culture. There's many more examples, but the last one I'm going to give, which I think is very important, is about how the US has changed in terms of being a part of a group, right? Because at the end of the day, collectivist society, it's about being a part of a group, right? Being a part of a community. In the past, Americans probably saw themselves as more just like a human, like I'm just a guy living in this country, whatever, as an individual. But nowadays, because of globalization and because of, let's say, increased polarization in politics, many more Americans attach themselves to a group than they did in the past. An obvious one here is about politics, right? 40 years ago, if you ask an American, like, tell me about yourself, maybe they'll say their job, where they're from, but they probably wouldn't say like, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. But nowadays, it's very common for people to associate themselves strongly with a political group. And although it might seem a bit strange, people who associate themselves with a group, even a political group, we can say are more collectivist in nature, right? Because they're like, oh, I'm a Democrat, this is my group, rather than just being, I'm a human being. And also, a point which is related to this is about nationalism, or let's just say pride in where you come from. For example, nowadays, if you're from California, then you're probably a proud Californian and you're probably a proud Democrat, right? Whereas if you're from Texas, you're probably a proud Texan and also a proud Republican, etc., etc. So in the past, whereas Americans were maybe more cosmopolitan, we could say, they just think of themselves like an individual, just like any human being kind of thing. Nowadays, because of globalization and more polarization, many more Americans group themselves with other people. This could be to say that I'm a proud Texan, I'm a proud Republican, etc., etc. In contrast, the Netherlands, which was rated 80 in individualism before, still very high, it was like number 3 in the world, now has a full score 100 points, right? So now the Netherlands apparently is the most individualistic country in the world. So what separates the Netherlands and the US in the modern day? Well, while the US has become maybe more nationalist or more, seeing themselves as parts of a group for various reasons, the Netherlands has only extended this idea of individualism by strengthening individual freedoms, for example, liberal drug laws or something like that. Euthanasia is legal in the Netherlands. And also, the Netherlands has a very strong social welfare system. So that means that, people who are out of work or have a disability or something, have kids, can probably receive some help, financial help, also like emotional support and stuff like that, for all of their needs, right? And the point here is, typically, in countries that have strong social systems, strong welfare systems, although social, you might think of collectivist, actually in collectivist societies, like we said before, there's a big importance on family. So usually, instead of the government or the state being relied upon to give you help, whether it be financial or emotional, etc., it would be the family members who are expected to help them instead of the state, right? So in the US, for example, social security is not that strong, right? If you don't have a job in the US, it's quite easy to become homeless. There's a lot of homelessness in the US, often a result of losing your job and spiraling into a bad way. In the Netherlands, although I don't know the statistics, I'm pretty sure that there's less homelessness because of the strong social system. So let's talk about China. Decades ago, when this research was originally done, China scored 20 on the dimension of individualism versus collectivism, 0 being absolutely collectivist, and therefore China being very collectivist. But in the most recent survey, they scored 43. So basically they've doubled, according to this research, in terms of individualism. So why could that be? Well, before talking about why, let's talk about why traditionally China is collectivist. Well, two main points are 1, Confucianism, and 2, the Maoist era. So basically Confucianism, which is still popular in China, advocates family values and hierarchy and all of the things which create a collectivist society, right? And although that's still quite popular, there are some other things at play nowadays which are influencing that. And second of all, the Maoist era. So more than half a century ago, during the Great Leap Forward, there was a lot of emphasis placed on collectivist activities, such as collectivist agricultural farming. In that era, many people living in rural areas were given quotas or some specific job, like, we want you to farm rice, we want you to farm vegetables, for example. By doing this, you're helping the country, you're doing your duty for the country. And, these principles and policies were clearly collectivist, to the extent where individualism was even stifled or discouraged. And things like having your own business was not just frowned upon, but almost impossible. But nevertheless, in the past couple of decades, China has become less and less collectivist. Still collectivist, but much less. And while collectivist values and principles were encouraged by Mao many years ago, almost 100 years ago, more recently in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping's principles and policies have made China become more individualistic. Firstly, because since then, China has become more outward-facing. That is to say, while in the Maoist era, China was very much a closed country which did not trade that much, did not import or export, kind of kept itself to itself. Under Deng Xiaoping, China created things like special economic zones, which encouraged exportation and encouraged international trade and things like that. the result of these changes were that people were able to be more business-minded. Instead of, being a farmer, you could make your own products, washing machines, nowadays mobile phones, etc., as a private business and sell them to around the world. So this, from an individual perspective, there's been more chances for individual success and to, do something like sell something, do a job which will improve your life personally, but maybe it's not really related to the society as a whole, or at least not directly. And strongly linked with this is urbanization and migration. So, in the Maoist era, many people lived in the countryside and farming was one of the biggest things. Nowadays, China has actually more than 100 cities with 1 million people or more. Europe has about 20, okay? just to compare the two. And it's funny because I have a lot of Chinese students, and obviously I ask, like, where are you from, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes they tell me a city, oh, I'm from this city, it's a small city. I say, oh, how many people? They say, oh, only 4 million. 4 million. In the UK, we only have one city which has more than 4 million, which is London. So yeah, China, for Chinese people, 4 million is like a medium city, small city. And that's because of the urbanization that's happened in the past decades, right? So this has helped to foster individualism, because in cities, there's more businesses, there's more jobs, there's more opportunities to work, and even opportunities to go in the rat race, right? We talked about the rat race in part 1. And although the rat race has a negative connotation, that, like a rat or somebody just running aimlessly, not really knowing what they're doing, at least the positive of the rat race in China is that people have been able to, get good jobs, earn a lot of money, and enter the middle class and start, spending money on things that they enjoy and, buying a nice car, getting an iPhone, right? Whereas in the past, a few decades ago, it would be unthinkable for Chinese people to splash out so much money, at least the average Chinese person, on something so superficial or superfluous, which is not really helping your family or your society, right? Having an iPhone instead of a Xiaomi, Chinese brand, I have that phone, is not really going to help the community, right? It's just for your own individual interest, your own, maybe think it's going to give you more status or something. So yeah, people moving to cities in China rather than in the countryside has made the country more individualistic, because people are working in more international companies or big companies instead of working in fields and working in family businesses. And by working in these companies, they can earn more money, they can think about their individual goals and dreams and things they want to do with their money, etc. And think less about, is this job going to help my society or something like that. And this also comes to the point of migration, because not only have Chinese people urbanized massively in the past decades, but nowadays it's also much more common for young people to move to cities which are not their hometown. Let's say a Chinese person that just graduated, but let's say their grandparents lived in the countryside, their parents moved to the city, which was close to their countryside home, but now these young adults are moving to another city. And the consequence of these young adults migrating to other cities is that naturally they cannot spend as much time with their family, right? And this is also spurring individualism in the country. So whereas in the past it was more common for Chinese people to, live at home with their parents, find a job in their town or in a nearby city, maybe, move out or maybe get married or something, but still live nearby, still often see their parents, often help their parents. Maybe even their parents come to live with them when they get older. Nowadays in China, it's a much more dynamic environment. And in somewhere like Beijing or Shanghai, a high percentage of the people are not natives. And that means they must have, in many cases, left their families, left their parents to pursue their own success, to pursue a better life, to pursue increased status, more money, etc. And, clearly and evidently, this is contributing to more individualism in China. And like I gave the example of the Netherlands to contrast the USA in terms of high individualism, now I would like to talk a little bit about Thailand. That's because, while, like I said, China has gone from being 20 to 43 in terms of individualism, so double, Thailand has gone from 20 to 19. Well, basically stayed the same. But the point is that a couple of decades ago, according to the research, China and Thailand were equal in terms of collectivism. But whereas Thailand has stayed the same or even become maybe a little bit more collectivist, China has become much more individualistic, like we mentioned. So what's the difference here? Why has Thailand stayed the same, but China changed? Well, we already know some of the reasons why China changed, but Thailand, why has it stayed collectivist? Well, I touched on this in the first part, and one of the key reasons could be about religion. While China is more or less an atheistic country, and their belief, at least on the government level, is more about communism than any particular religion, Thailand is a Buddhist country. And in Buddhism, collectivist values are number one. That's the main thing about Buddhism, more or less. And I have a Thai student, and we've talked many times about culture and so on. She still lives with her parents, even though she's an adult. And this is quite normal in Thailand. Like I said, in China, it's become much more common to migrate to other cities in search of work and opportunities and, leave the family. Still in Thailand, it's very common for people to stay in the city where they're from, to not move to another city and leave their family, but rather to stay close to their family, because family still in Thailand is extremely important. This could also be because in Thailand, there's not that many big cities. Like I said, I got to say it again, in China, there's more than 100 cities with 1 million people, and like 10 cities with more than 5 million people. On the other hand, in Thailand, Bangkok is the main city. There's a couple more cities around Bangkok, like Nothamburi or something like that. But basically, the area of Bangkok is the central hub of the country. So, if you're from a small city, I'm sure it's common for people to move out, maybe go to the big city, move to Bangkok in search of opportunities. But, many people already live in Bangkok. So the people who are from Bangkok, it's unlikely that they will move to another place, not just because, Bangkok is their home or whatever, but because their family is there and it wouldn't be right for them to do it. Especially, and, you can agree or disagree, but especially if you are the daughter. In Thailand and many, more traditional or collectivist societies, it's more of the daughter's role to look after the parents when they get older. So maybe if you're the son, maybe if you're a guy and you're from Bangkok and you want to, travel the world and live in another country, it's possible. But if you're a daughter, according to their culture, it's your responsibility to look after your parents when they get older. It's not the state's responsibility. It's not the social welfare's responsibility, right? We talked about the Netherlands. When people get old in the Netherlands, it's not really anyone's, the son or daughter is not responsible to, take in their mother or father for them to live with them when they get old. That's not very common in Europe. But in Thailand, it's very common for daughters to allow or, invite their parents to live with them when they get older, because it's seen as a duty to their family. Because, like I said, it's a collectivist society. And what is one of the main reasons why it's a collectivist society? Because now in the modern day and since hundreds of years, Thailand is a strongly Buddhist country. So that concludes this episode of the More Than English podcast, which was part 2, looking at the second dimension of Hofstede, which was individualism versus collectivism. In the first part, we defined what it meant to be individualistic or collectivist in a society, and we gave some possible consequences of what that means. And today, in this second episode, I've given you a few national examples, specifically the US and China, but also looking a bit at the Netherlands and Thailand, about how these ideas work in the real world. I hope you enjoyed it, and please let me know what you think about my analyses of these countries. If I talked about your country, I would be really interested to know if you feel like I gave a good account, accurate account of your country. And if you're from another country, I would just love to know if you agree with the score that your nation gets. There's a link to the Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions scores in the description. So please take a look at the score of your country, and then you can tell me if the score you think is accurate. And moreover, you can think about whether you as an individual fit this score. So for example, if you're from China and China got a score of 43, would you say that, I'm probably about 43, I would say? Or are you different? Let me know.
And finally, here's today's key vocabulary. Page 1. Drastically, in an extreme way. Conversely, in the opposite way, on the other hand. Inception, the beginning of an official activity. Exemplify, to be a typical or good example of something. Unequivocally, very clearly and without doubt, undoubtedly. Nominally, face value of money without adjusting for inflation. Indigenous, a person or thing living in the homeland of their ancestors. Polarization, when people are divided into two opposing groups. Page 2. Cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world rather than of a specific place. Euthanasia, the act of killing for humane purposes, for example, to end their pain. Advocate, to publicly support or suggest an idea or way of doing something. To be at play, to have an influence in a situation. Stifle, to prevent something from happening or being continued. Connotation, a feeling or an idea that is often associated with a word or phrase. Splash out, to spend a lot of money, especially on luxuries. Superfluous, something unnecessary or more than is needed. And finally, to spur, to encourage an activity or development and speed it up. Thanks guys, see you next time.